So welcome everyone to the latest in our series of vodcasts for the University of Glasgow Theology and Religious Studies, Hope Against Hope series of vodcasts which we're releasing every day during the COP26 conference in Glasgow. My name's Doug Gay and I teach practical theology here at the University of Glasgow. So I'm a little out of my depth with our two guests today as a mere practical theologian, but we'll see how we get on. And I'm sitting here on a beautifully sunny day, autumn winter day in Glasgow, and out of my office window here, I wish I could show you, I can see directly down into the COP site and the difference. So it's been an extraordinary feeling for us, looking forward to this, preparing for this, and knowing that people were gathering to discuss the future of the planet and the future of life on the planet. So this is one of our attempts to respond to this, and I'm very delighted to welcome two distinguished guests, two of the most important thinkers working in theology, which is directly, I think, related to the concerns of the COP, working in the UK today. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So our guests are Peter Scott and David Clough. And Peter, I'm going to go to you first and just ask you if you can briefly, for those watching, many of whom will know you and your work, but a few may not. So if you can introduce yourself briefly.
Thanks very much, Doug. And well, thanks for having me. And it's very good to be here and joining in on this conversation during the period when COP26 is meeting. As I was just saying, my name is Peter Scott. I'm speaking to you from Manchester, England, where indeed it is also a very fine day. And I teach at the University of Manchester. I'm the holder of the Samuel Ferguson Chair in Applied Theology. And by tradition, the holders of the Ferguson Chair concentrate on issues to do with theology and contemporary issues. And I also direct the Lincoln Theological Institute, which is a research institute based at the University of Manchester. And I mention that because we've had a number of research projects related to climate change. I think it's now 3 dating back to 2008. And my teaching and research are sort of at the intersection between political theology and ecological theology.
That's fantastic. And David, this is not quite breaking news, I think, but you have had a recent update to your CV that you'll maybe tell us about.
Thanks. Yes, I've just completed 14 years at the University of Chester, mostly as Professor of Theological Ethics. And I've probably spent about the last 15 years of that engaging with theology and the more than human world. Thinking in particular about Christian theology and ethics in relation to animals, and what that might mean for Christian practice. As I say, I've just reached the end of that time, just have been appointed as Professor of Theology and Applied Sciences at the University of Aberdeen. So you find me in a brief moment where I'm unemployed for the first time this century, but later this month we'll be gainfully employed again, north of the border.
Thanks both. And Chester's loss is very definitely Scotland's gain. So welcome to Scotland, David. It's great to have you working as part of the theological community here. Now, many different people, I think, will be watching this vodcast. There will be colleagues from different countries. There will be students and research students, and there may be other interested folks who are interested in the connections between faith and belief and climate change. So I wonder if I could ask both of you. Both of you have produced work which engages very directly with themes of ecology and sustainability, and with the relationship between the human and the non-human or the more than human creation. So I wonder whether I could ask you both, and again I'm going to start with Peter, if you could just say a little bit about your own theological development, and particularly what led you to work with these themes and questions. And perhaps you could also mention one publication in which you have engaged with them.
Sure, yes. I mean, mine's been a rather circuitous route into this particular area. So some decades ago, I was researching in liberation theology and Marxism, and I became especially interested in the way that the Latin American liberation theologians were struck by how certain sort of spheres of life, but not least the economy, seem to be naturalized in certain kinds of ways, to be understood to be unchangeable. And I found that particularly interesting, as if certain features of social life were outside or out with the social process, and how that gets coded as natural. That was kind of really interesting to me. So the natural, in the sense of social affairs being designated natural as outside historical time and outside social agency. And from there, I moved on to engaging with theories and theologies of technology, where it seemed to me something similar was also going on, that technological change or technological development was somehow seen to be unrelated to the society in which it was going on, or it was determined, sort of deterministic views of technology. And that seemed to be another way, as I came to see it, of naturalizing, in inverted commas, various processes. But then through that, technology is the transformation of the human world, became a theme of my research. And then, of course, how it is that technology transforms nature. And so at that point, I emerged at what I came to call a political theology of nature. And indeed, the intersection between society, nature, and technology is where my research remains, actually. So in my latest book-length effort, A Theology of Post-Natural Right, which was published a couple of years ago, I'm maintaining my interest in those particular themes. So it's an effort to develop an ethics suitable, if you like, for a period in which the Earth's climate is warming. So I'm trying to find some way of integrating a sense of this extra human world into a sense of what society might be. It's what I call a greater society, a society which is populated by human creatures, to be sure, but other creatures as well.
Thanks, that's terrific. And I want to come back to some of those themes in just a minute. But David, I want you to ask you the same question. I mean, if I could, we'll have noticed the change in your job titles between the job you've just been doing and the job you're going to, and in a sense, looking back, you started in a much more conventional path within, if I can say that, within theological ethics. You were looking at issues of pacifism and dialoguing with Karl Barth and others, but then you began, and I wonder how many of your friends and colleagues saw this coming. It's not been the most traveled road within theology to develop a highly distinctive focus on animals, animal welfare, and the more than human world. So can you tell us, how did you get from one to the other?
I think I was puzzled. I think during my teenage years, I became increasingly sensitized to issues of animal suffering and well-being. I became vegetarian as soon as I went to university, and I felt like what I ate was an obviously moral choice that I had to decide about for myself. And I think I was puzzled then, and as I started off in natural sciences and undergraduate, and then switched to theology a couple of years later. And in my engagements with fellow Christians, in my encounters with fellow students studying theology and ethics, I was very struck that it was by no means the rule that people saw an obvious connection between faith and concern for animals, or the need to rethink our consumption of animals as a Christian ethical issue. And so, when I did a PhD on Barth's ethics, which I kind of saw as an apprenticeship in thinking how to approach ethics from a theological point of view. And then I kind of had a laundry list of things that it seemed to me needed a bit more attention. So there was a sort of a gap that merited attention, and not so many people were engaging Christian pacifism and the Iraq War, which was my first book post-PhD. And then it seemed to me that animals was worth a little bit of time. And I don't think I was expecting for a moment that it was going to be the next 15 years of my career. But as I began to think about, could I write a book, A Christian Ethics of Animals? I began to realize that that would need a lot more undergirding as a sort of theological task before I could make progress with that. And so what ended up, I literally had a proposal for Christian Ethics of Animals that then became a proposal for a 2-volume work, the book on animals that I wrote, that started off in systematic theology, and then the second volume, published in 2019, looked at the implications for that new settlement of Christian thinking about animals in relation to how we're using animals in all kinds of ways. So yes, I take your point that that's not an obvious route from a PhD on BART, but actually there's an interesting yet to be told story about people who have done PhDs on BART and then have developed environmental and animal interests. So Andrew Lindsay wrote a PhD on BART and then went to think about animals. Paul Santmeyer wrote a PhD on BART and then carried on thinking about environmental ethics in a Christian perspective. And while this wasn't a major preoccupation of BART, there are really interesting trajectories within BART's thought for taking fellow creatures seriously. And I think that's the sort of fundamental sort of starting point for me in relation to our thinking about animals and the more than human world, a sort of repositioning of human beings as fellow creatures among other creatures, and recognizing that basic solidarity, which is very closely related to the political work that Peter's referred to. Thinking theologically from that positioning of fellow creatures, rather than some sort of absurd halfway point between the earth and God, which is how I think many theological constructions have depicted the human.
And I think you've begun to answer this, but I just want to follow on with that. Has this, you said it grew bigger than you expected it to, and lasted longer, but is that partly because this is in a sense become more than almost a topic within theological ethics? I'm tempted to say, is it a kind of refiguring of your understanding of theology and the task of systematic theology, or is that pushing it too far?
Well, I think I'm still discovering quite what it means. I'm certainly a very different theologian and a very different ethicist for having spent a decade or so thinking about the animal question. And so I think what I've done up to this point is sort of start from the practical issue. We need more practical theologians, Doug, and the last thing we need at this point and in this juncture is impractical theologians. So I think I really started from the challenge of there seems to be something deeply wrong in our relationships with fellow creatures, and then sort of was driven to various systematic questions like what's the point of creation, what's creation for, what are creatures for, how do we give an account of creaturely life under major Christian doctrinal headings, as a way of kind of approaching the ethical questions. And so I think once you begin to push those questions, then everything is up for grabs and everything is at stake, because these are questions that have very rarely been the focus of Christian theological attention previously. And so, you know, as I think about sort of next steps, I think ways of thinking more generally about what it means to do theology from the perspective of this positioning as fellow creatures is a really important task, and might be really important for theological engagement with the climate crisis and other environmental challenges that we face.
Now, is it okay just to come in there?
Please.
I just wanted to say, just to your point about, you know, systematic theology, it suddenly popped into my head that when Michael Northcott and I were leading a project that became a collection of essays called Systematic Theology and Climate Change, one of the things that we did there was differentiate across across 2 chapters between creation and creatures. So instead of having, what would normally be all these issues in one chapter, we decided that actually, in terms of this kind of new horizon of climate change, trying to find ways of, acknowledging that, if you like, the topics of systematic theology might be being reconfigured, was one perhaps rather limited way in which we tried to do that. But the other thing that pops into my head, just hearing David talk then, is Johann Baptist Metz's 4 questions. Who does theology where, and then crucially, in whose interests and for whom? And it seems to me, I think there are very severe difficulties in thinking about in whose interests and for whom from the perspective of an ecological theology, but it seems to me at least that is on the agenda now, which be, I think, another way of framing what David was saying in his kind of closing remarks there.
That's very helpful, and that's actually a perfect segue. What David was saying about the focus of theology and what you've just said is a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask you about next, which is I want to ask you both to comment on, if you like, on the state of the discipline in terms of theological engagement with the issues around COP26. And we've already mentioned some of the important names working in these fields. But I suppose one of my question is do you think that our children will look back and say that why was so little theological attention directed towards this? Do you think they will worry that we were asleep, if you like, in the face of this? Or do you think they will think, well, we did okay, we got it right? What's your sense of how the state of the discipline and its willingness to respond to these questions? Peter, can I stay with you on that?
Yes, sure. I think a little bit would depend on what we mean by theology. So I think there's quite a lot of theology in action, so to speak, in response to this. So sort of, beyond kind of professional or academic or technical theology, it seems to me there is, just thinking of the publication of Laudato Si in 2015, it did seem to have a kind of galvanizing effect. But whether there's a galvanizing effect in relation to academic theology, I'm not sure. But it seems to me all sorts of, for want of a better phrase, practical theology, not least a lot of decisions that the churches then began to make in the last few years, especially over decarbonisation and what it means for these institutions to get to carbon net zero, and a number of them choosing very early dates, it seems to me, for carbon net zero. So, if that's to be included as theological work, and I think I would want to include it as theological work, and then a number of activist organizations like Christian Climate Action and what have you, it seems to me that new action and that new practice is clearly closely related to certain sorts of theological understandings. But for academic theology, I'm not quite sure about this. I know at the Lincoln Theological Institute, we had a project back in 2008, which was looking at the apocalyptic imagination and climate change, and in what ways the kind of structure of apocalyptic discourse and apocalyptic metaphors, including terms like tipping point and those sorts of terms which have become very central to the climate change discussion, whether actually they are a kind of sub-apocalyptic discourse. And there has been, in the last 2 or 3 years, it seems to me, quite a large production of theological volumes. But I think what I want to say to this, and this, in a way, this goes back to David's comments. I wonder if there aren't really quite severe difficulties for theology in all this. So I think we've already hinted at the whole question about representation. So, what is it that to do theology, and to say something convincing about the representation of the non-human by the human. So it seems to me this is one of the issues that David's work has so forcefully put on the agenda. So it seems to me we may well have a difficulty there. I think there may also be another really difficulty, that another set of voices we need to hear from the global south. And are there kind of constitutive problems in theology about, you know, hearing voices beyond a certain border or beyond a certain boundary? So, you know, it seems to me that usefully work could be done, you know, and whether that's a kind of, in a sense, it's a kind of colonial mindset still, isn't it? It's a kind of colonial outlook. And, you know, we're going to need to find some way of overcoming that. So the future of this area of inquiry might be, you know, a closer alignment of kind of post-colonial theology and ecological theology. It seems to me to be emphatically on the agenda. And it seems to me, but a further issue, it seems to me, is in relation to Christianity's investment in what I call personalism. That is a kind of exceptionalist attention to the human and the sorts of characteristics which are said to be defining of the human, like reason, will, dispositions, you know, etc., etc. And it seems to me, if this is embedded deeply in the kind of Christian theological imaginary, then it may well be that if there is a sense in which theology has not engaged with us as fully as it might have done and has not developed as quickly as it might have done, it may be that there is a kind of crisis going on within theology at the present time. It doesn't have the same feel or the same tone, I think, as, say, you know, the crisis that emerged in Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s. But it might be a crisis of similar sorts of depth, if you like, and that Karl Barth may have been you know, an important theologian in both these areas. Discussion is certainly interesting. And just to go back to David's comment, it'd be really interesting to explore, you know, that the issue of the status of natural theology now. And, you know, one would ordinarily have said, you know, in the development of an ecological theology, natural theology might be important, but we're obviously also very aware that it was precisely the critique of natural theology in the 1930s and 1940s that, if you like, address that particular theological crisis. So how those two points link up, you know, I'm not really entirely sure, but that climate change may be confronting academic or professional theology, and it'd be really interesting to know if practical theology, like the sort of theologies articulated by activist movements and other parts of the church, in a sense running ahead of academic theology, you know, if we haven't yet found ways of excavating this personalism and, you know, trying to find different ways of thinking about the centrality of the human. I mean, I'm thinking here of you know, Celia Dean Drummond's work, where, you know, she's trying to develop you know, the metaphor of drama, it seems to me, to find a way beyond thinking about story and the centrality of the human to this story of redemption. I've been trying to work it out in relation to social metaphors, you know, as I've hinted earlier on, in relation to conceptions of society. And maybe the fact that the climate change crisis is kind of is working at a very strange pace, if you like, you know. So there's a North American theorist whose name I can't quite recall, who talks about in terms of a slow crisis. Yeah, but just because it's a slow crisis doesn't mean to say that it isn't a deep crisis. But maybe on account of its slowness, maybe the depth of the theological crisis is not quite yet evident to us. And I think it's in relation to personalism that I would trace that.
That's really fascinating, Peter. And David, the same question to you. And what do you, the state of the field as you look around? I mean, are you encouraged by the number of people beginning to work in these areas, or do you think there's still a lot of catching up to be done, and we've not had our eye on the ball, if you like, within theology?
I mean, I think environmental interests in theology have definitely been minority sport until reasonably recent times, and that is a significant problem. And I think Peter's diagnosis is really helpful. We obviously look out at the world from our own point of view, and theology has taken human preoccupations, as important, and that has its sort of rightful place. But I think there's been a long time in which voices from the margins, politically, globally, theologically, ecclesially, have been calling for a kind of new settlement and a new way of thinking about understanding the more than human world. And mostly Christian theology, until reasonably recently, and theological ethics has shrugged and said, we've got more important things to be getting on with. Thanks very much. And the curricula are going to stay the same, thanks very much, and we're still going to read this stuff, and we're still going to be preoccupied by these set of questions, and that's a big problem, and it's a failing. It's a key theological task is to read the signs of the times, and I think this has been largely a failure to read the signs of the times, and we haven't given theological attention commensurate with the obvious slow urgency of the crisis that we face, and so that's an issue that and a problem. And for me it's a particular frustration, because it seems to me that Christian theology in particular has lots of resources for being able to escape an anthropocentric perspective. If you're Brian Cox and you're trying to find meaning in the universe, you've got very few resources other than the human to pick on. But Christians and Christian theologians in particular ought to have been able to reach for a way of construing the creaturely world that goes beyond that. And so that seems to me to be a missed opportunity. But in the time that I've been paying theological attention to animals, I've been really struck by how far that's becoming a core interest. How far it's becoming, a sort of animals chapter is now a sort of required part of a handbook of creation. There's more and more PhDs being written on sort of animal theology and so on. And so it's there is definitely a change afoot, both in relation to animals and in environmental concerns more widely. But I have a frustration that we should have been ahead of the game. We should have been able to get a grip on that, and there have been lots of sort of noble individuals, theologians and movements within the church, as Peter refers to, that have taken this up. But the Theological Academy and churches as a whole, until recently, haven't really grasped the urgency of the issue.
Peter mentioned Laudato Si. I mean, does that stand out as a landmark in the area that you've been working in? And do you have any reflections on how that has changed the sort of context in which we're doing academic theology?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important contribution. I think the way that it connects a solidarity with the poor and solidarity with the earth is absolutely crucial for a Christian engagement with these issues, because there's the kind of environmentalism that has ignored human well-being and sort of jumped to a sort of ecological perspective without paying attention to the vulnerability of particular groups of humans has been rightly criticized. And so I think Pope Francis got it exactly right, that if Christians are going to engage with our environmental concerns, they need to be doing that alongside recognition of the need of solidarity for the poor, and being paying attention, giving priority attention to the well-being of those who are poor and oppressed, alongside paying attention to these environmental concerns. And that's not a difficult thing to do, because almost all of the time, as you know, as we've been hearing, you know, just during the COP summit, it's the poor and marginalized who are most likely to be among the first victims of environmental catastrophes, such as the climate crisis that we're bringing on ourselves at the moment. So it's really important and right to see these things together. But some environmentalists have not grasped that, and therefore provoked all kinds of unnecessary clashes of interests, because they haven't been attending to that issue. But in terms of animals, Laudato Si is very frustrating, because it starts off with a deeply important Franciscan sensibility of recognizing fellow creatures as sisters and brothers, but then really neglects to look at the implications of what it might mean to consider fellow creatures as sisters and brothers. There's a sort of glaring omission in relation to engaging with industrialized animal agriculture, which, you know, is disastrous environmentally and for farmed animals and for wild animals and for human well-being, and so would be a really obvious issue to address at that sort of nexus of human, environmental, creaturely well-being. So that was a disappointment, but I think it's a really important foundation and reference point for theological work. And there's lots of good theological work that's being done on the foundations of that, and lots of good practical work on initiatives for bringing change on the basis of the Laudato Si foundation. So I'm really encouraged by that, but also aware of what we need to say beyond Laudato Si.
And that's actually interesting, of where there's more to be done. Peter, I want to go back to you, and I wanted to ask you about in a political theology of nature. You talked about your background having worked in liberation theology, and I would suggest that in the world of systematic theology, in terms of people who are engaging at the more philosophical end of critical theory and Marxism, you clearly have particular interests and abilities. There are parts of political theology of nature which I found a pretty challenging read, I'm going to say. But I was also fascinated by the fact that you seem to be engaging with deep ecology and the philosophical dimensions of deep ecology, and a theology of materialism and the material, which you're connecting to the natural. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, as I say, maybe just to help me, because as I say, some of that was a real workout. I don't know if I'm the first person to tell you that.
And no, people normally say, you know, I write, you know, light, frothy stuff, and you know, they take my stuff on holiday to the beach. You know, when they go by train, of course. Yes. Well, I mean, I suppose I was engaging with deep ecology and social ecology and ecofeminist theory and what have you. You know. I suppose this is kind of what we mostly do for kind of self-education reasons. But the problem I was struck by, although I don't think I saw it especially clearly at the time, was actually this problem, I think, to do with personalism, that I couldn't kind of quite work out how it is that in much theological discussion, nature referred to human nature, as it turned out, despite sometimes declaring otherwise and clearly wanting to go in some sort of different kind of direction. So I was struck by these critical theorists who seem to be working very hard, but in a variety of different ways. And the politics of some of these positions interested me especially. So there are kind of more what I would call naturalistic positions, as in deep ecology, which seems to be suggesting some sort of human conformity to the kind of structures of the wider world in which we find ourselves. But then, you know, more anarchistic options And then other options are stressing more the way that nature gets kind of produced by a capitalist come industrial society. So I was struck, and this connects actually to a point that David was making a moment ago in trying to connect the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Clearly what we don't want is to hear and respond to the cry of the earth, which kind of operates as a detour round the cry of the poor, to avoid all sorts of abstractions. I mean, the sorts of abstractions that Marx criticized of Feuerbach, it seems to me, and I think I've always got this in the back of my mind. So I was trying to develop a kind of case to say, look, there are these kind of critical theorists who are exploring the relationship between humanity and nature in much more detailed and much more sophisticated and much more interactive kinds of ways. And that's what I then wanted to take forward into what it turned out was a kind of, a Christology and a pneumatology, as I remember aright. So I wanted to find some way of it. I needed resources. I needed resourcing. I could see what I had this kind of Christological framing, and I had this kind of new pneumatological dynamic. So just to go back to David's point again about the resources that Christian theology might bring to this, I felt there were important resources, but when I kind of wanted some of the fine-grained detail, and when I wanted a rather more emphatic engagement with the way in which human beings are interacting with nature at the present time, in kind of in distorting and dominating kinds of ways, I couldn't quite that didn't seem to me quite so readily available in Christian theology. So I was picking my way through that material, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense, as I say, and I think it was one of the, for me, one of the most important and insightful themes in the book, and I learned a lot from it. I hope I learned a lot from it. David, I want to steer, for both of you, I want to actually steer us towards a particular theological topic now, which I think is very resonant at the moment, and that's the idea of a theology of hope and how that might be changing. And at the end of my political theology class that I teach at Glasgow, on the final day, I have a more sort of slightly informal conversation with the students, and I ask them some questions. But one of the questions I ask each time I teach the course is, do you think who was more hopeful, your parents' generation or your generation? And particularly addressing it, there's some older people in the class, but addressing this to the younger students. And almost without exception, they've said our parents' generation. And I find that as a parent myself, and I find that a hard thing to hear. And around me in Glasgow at the moment, there's lots of young people who and activists who are consumed by a sense of urgency, but I also think I sense anxiety about hope and the question of hope. Can I ask you to say something about that?
Yeah, I contributed to an ecumenical report maybe 8-9 years ago called Hope in God's Future, Theology and Climate Change. And hope seemed to me to be absolutely at the core of a theological engagement with this issue. But it's really important to get some parameters in place to avoid that being, horrifically unhelpful and problematic. So there's, obviously one complete theological dead end, which says, well, hope means that God will sort of sort this crisis out for us, and we can sort of sit back and let it happen. It must be in God's plan. And I think that's so we're getting to some really deep theology there about how we construct ideas of God's action in the world. But it's a profound theological mistake to think that God we've got theological reason to believe that God will rescue us from, and other creatures, from the implications of our mistakes. And we don't need to go far into history to recognize that calamitous events happen that are disastrous for humans and disastrous for other creatures, and they happen. And so any attempt to say this is in God's hands, therefore it doesn't need to be a Christian worry, is obviously a disastrous way of constructing Christian hope. But also, I think we need to beware an idea of hope which places everything in, all our hopes, in sort of human competence and capability and power. So I think we do wrong to think that theologically we can say, okay, we're going to sort this all out. We can put, this is in our control. With this and this in terms of policy actions, everything will be sorted by date X. I think we've got really good theological reasons for saying, empirically, we've got lots of evidence for thinking, for doubting that, in terms of a theological analysis of how humans work and how political systems work and how vested interests work and how many people have got really important reasons to profit from status quo and not doing anything that would be in our sort of collective enlightened self-interest. And also, I think there's the kind of really oppressive sort of burden of activism if you think that this is all in my hands and you place all your hope in, am I going to be the one that is effective in reversing this calamity? And so, given that there are both of those reasons to think wrongly about hope, I think it's a demanding task to think about how to speak properly about Christian hope in a way that resources the kinds of action that we need. For me, the kind of hope that we need has already gone through grief and anger. It seems to me that it's really important to recognize, as again, so many voices have been recognizing during COP26, that this is already a calamity, this is already a crisis. People have already died, people have already been displaced from their homes by, sort of willful lack of political action, because it hasn't suited people's preferences and economic interest to take the action that has been obviously required for some time. So we're in the middle of this crisis, and we all ought to be really sad about what has been lost already, what will be lost in terms of the things that are already irreversible in relation to the climate change that we have created. And we ought to be angry about that as well. And that anger can be a useful motivator in relation to action and can be an ally of hope. But I think to sustain activism, we need to sort of marshal that anger in a way that says, okay, I can't leave it all to God, and it's also not all in my hands. So how, as a sort of finite creature, with the location that I have and the kind of opportunities that I have to act, what am I called to do? And that seems to me to be, a way of framing a kind of Christian activism that might have the resource to get me and all of the rest of us who care about this stuff from today to tomorrow to next month and to next year, to say, okay, so it's my task to think about my vocation, to think about the things the levers that are within my reach to pull, within my sort of resources of energy and capability, and knowing what I can, knowing what I know, standing where I stand, being able to do the kinds of things that I can do. What is it that today and tomorrow and the next day I'm being called to do? And the truth about being able to put things, recognize that this isn't all about us, and taking a view of a sort of Christian spirituality of activism, I think is sort of negotiating that tension between it matters me being faithful to my calling and living, faithfully in response to this particular challenge. But it's not all on me or any of us. And there is meaningful things that we can do, whatever the outcome. And faithfulness does not finally depend on this or that final result. It means doing what is before us today and tomorrow. And so that's the kind of way that I'd begin to try and frame the theological account of hope we need to sustain us in these difficult days.
That's very helpful. Peter, I'm going to ask you the same question. I mean, famously, obviously, in the aftermath of the Second World War, and particularly in his reflection on the Holocaust and then on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Moltmann, constructs a new theology of hope. What does a theology of hope look like for the times we're living? I mean, and David's already spoken to that very powerfully just now, but how would you address that question?
Well, it seems to me the reference to Moltmann and Nagasaki and Hiroshima is just right in a couple of ways, because it seems to me that part of that discussion is later joined by Gordon Kaufman, isn't it, when he's doing his Theology for a Nuclear Age. That might even be the title of the book, but I'm not absolutely convinced of that. But he's exploring the same sort of concerns that David was talking about, about whether or not a God will rescue us, and those sorts of, it seems to be kind of false hope kinds of desires, or false hope kinds of wishes, and I certainly want to say that if you hope can't be pushing resolutions onto some sort of Deus ex machina, and that would take us back into an earlier period, wouldn't it, and into Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Wouldn't it? And I think it's in the prison writings. He talks about we can't be thinking of a God who's going to function in some sort of Deus ex machina kind of way and kind of resolve things at the end of the play. But it seems to me also an interesting question about whether this is a kind of civilizational turn, so to speak. And whether our current way of life, is carbon fueled, isn't it? It's coal carbon fueled, it's petrocarbon fueled. So it'd be an interesting question whether that civilization is in a way coming to an end, and whether there have been other examples in Christian history of civilizations coming to an end, and Christians hoping and enduring through it. So whether there will be other examples or other comparisons that we could make. But it seems to me here the whole notion of conversion strikes me as being interesting. If we're talking about the conversion of a society, are there also motifs in relation to religious conversion that might be a kind of hopeful response to our present situation? I suppose if hope is not optimism, is it? Moltmann has kept saying that. So hope is not optimism. So I think it can't be about trying to take various actions necessarily to avoid a certain kind of end. Presumably that's David's activism, but nor can it be a kind of passive resignation. The end is coming towards us at such sort of disorienting pace that in a way we can't do anything. So we can neither sort of retreat into a kind of religious quietism, nor into a sort of spiritually energized kind of hyper activism. So I guess it's it's some sort of medium between those two. And the only other thing I guess I'd want to say is that about some notion about surprise, really, hope and surprise, because have there been occasions actually in the 20th century where change has come about really pretty quickly, and changes. So, you know, I'm thinking about the emergence of societies after 1945, and then again 1989, which in a way we wouldn't have anticipated. We couldn't probably have predicted the structures that would have emerged, and yet change, in fact, quite deep change, happened quite quickly. So, you know, whether there's a sense in which a certain sort of spirituality of hope, which is kind of focused on the desire for change, even if it can't quite be seen, if its outlines can't be seen, doesn't mean to say that we're not, you know, on the way to change. And just to loop back to the very top of this conversation, it seems to me that would be that would be one of the tasks of theology. It seems to me, you know, how does theology prepare for deep change, which we can't quite see the outlines of at the present time? I think I'll stop with that.
No, that's very helpful, and we could spend another hour talking about what you've just begun to point us towards, and we don't have another hour. We probably have to finish very, very soon, but I want to ask each of you, just in conclusion, I'm going to give you a choice, either to say something about, we're only 3 days into COP, but I assume you've both been watching it with attentively, either to say something that has provoked you to theological reflection that you've noticed about it so far or in the lead up to this COP in Glasgow, or the other option is if there's one particular thing that you see as something that gives you hope, just to continue that, and it could be something which is not necessarily within the world of theology, but just to bring us right up to date, really, I suppose, any thoughts about where we are 4 days into COP? We're recording this podcast, and something that's either given you hope or something that's provoked you to theological reflection about what you've seen of COP so far. And I'll go to you, David, first on that.
Thanks. I mean, it's quite a spectacle, isn't it? And I mean, I've been glad to see this speeches from leaders of nations that are most directly experiencing the climate change now, and I'm encouraged to think that if the assembled political leaders you know, go away without having made the commitments that are required of them, it won't be on the basis of not having heard. And I think I've been struck by being part of Christian gatherings, which I think have done that really well over the last sort of decade or so. And the church globally is one means of listening to neighbors who have you know, different experience and are more exposed to particular challenges. And so I think it's very good that COP has been making space for those voices. I've seen, you know, criticisms of how it's failed to engage adequately with Indigenous voices, and I think that so there's more work to do. But I think theologically it's a very good thing that that political leaders are being assembled, sat down, and required to listen hard to those voices. I'm sad that the UK government hasn't been doing more in relation to good preparation in relation to this summit. I'm sad that it doesn't look, you know, by any means certain that COP is going to end with the kinds of commitments that are required in relation to path to net zero. But I would try to remain hopeful that this encounter and this listening could be productive, you know, in and beyond this current conference.
Yeah, it puts me in mind, there's a very powerful art installation just been assembled in Glasgow Cathedral by Gardner and Gardner, two Glasgow artists, and it's called I Will Learn to Sit With You and I Will Learn to Listen. And they've done extraordinary things just with reassembling chairs in different shapes. So I've seen the pictures and I'm going to see it tomorrow. Peter, a last word from you as well, as you've been observing COP. And what's in your mind at the moment?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I certainly concur with David that it clearly is, it is quite a spectacle. And you kind of think of all the planning and all the resourcing that leads up to an event like this, and wonder whether it's kind of quite the appropriate forum and way of working. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But I mean, I certainly would want to say something very strongly, affirmative in relation to the kind of civil society engagement. I mean, perhaps that does feel a little bit for those involved in that, like, you're kind of stuck on the outside looking in. But it seems to me, that sense of, a wider constituency, a wider set of groups engaged with the issue, and if you like, looking for highly positive outcomes, I think it's just kind of remarkable and very wonderful, and that does cheer me up, and I think that is kind of grounds for hope. And in a sense, I think some of that activity will continue, won't it? Even when these great conferences are not taking part. So in a sense, although they only come into vision around these sorts of gatherings, for many of us, perhaps, in a sense, this kind of ongoing work of civil society, not least religious groups in civil society, will carry on, which kind of leads me into the sort of political theological point that I wanted to make. I've begun to wonder whether kind of global government or gatherings of global governments and planetary governance are not the same thing. And I mean, it'll depend a little bit about what the outcomes of this are, but really whether some notion of planetary governance, which will go through governments, but won't only go through governments, and whether there are kind of different ways of organizing and coordinating and supporting at the planetary scale, to which I think religious groups, including churches, may well be crucial there, because either as individual churches or in networks of churches, they do have this kind of planetary, multi-locational, multi-geographic reach, if you will. So that's what's kind of in my mind at the minute are kind of alternative processes and alternative strategies. I mean, perhaps they've been emerging, for some time, but it's a while now since the difficulties at Copenhagen, isn't it? I mean, it's more than a decade since the COP at Copenhagen, kind of didn't really achieve what it wanted to achieve. It's not really clear to me that the decisions made at the Paris COP, was that 2015, have really been followed through on, not least in the kind of transfer of money from north to south. So presumably at some point, and entirely appropriately, that hope is expressed at a whole range of levels, including at local and networked levels. That notion of governance, a rather different notion, what I'm thinking at the minute to call planetary governance, might begin to emerge, and in a way I would think that is hopeful as well, whatever the outcomes of COP26.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think, I mean, so much to say about that in relation to technology and social networks and the ways in which they are, operating in transnational and international ways. Friends, the time has gone. I'm preparing to preach on this Sunday on what we've called COP Sunday. And I noticed that in the lectionary, there are two readings as I was preparing to do that. And Psalm 146, of course, famously says, "Put not your trust in princes." And that has been in my mind. But the gospel reading that's paired with that for this Sunday is the reading of the Widow's Mite. which is also about, earlier in the passage about the widows' houses being devoured. So some of the themes we've explored about the poor and the relationship between theological attention to that and to the planet. But I suppose maybe the image I want to close with is that the other thing that struck me from that is that there's a very interesting sparse narrative, but one of the things that happens is Jesus sits down and watches. And there's this very deliberate sense of taking up a position of attentiveness where you can see what's going on. And maybe that's not such a bad metaphor for the task of theology in these very challenging times. I'm so grateful to both of you, Peter Scott and David Clough, for giving us this time and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you very much on behalf of the University of Glasgow.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Doug. It's been a pleasure.